Outdoor dunnies were the only dunnies there were in those days. Look, I left there when I was young, when I was 4 or 5, but those early memories are they're so formative. The smell of that country, the dry dust smell, the smell of dry grass, the sense of being saturated in this heavy sunlight. Those early memories remain with you in quite a mysterious way. And there are certain memories from that time which I think of as like sort of rock formations around which corals can form. In other words, stories can form around these very few rock-like structures of memory.
You spent a lot of time by yourself.
Yeah.
Do you think that's where the love of writing and stories and imagination came from?
Certainly imagination, for sure. We were very isolated on that property, and then even when we moved to eastern Queensland, behind Caloundra, that lovely hinterland that you know so well, even there, it was a very, very solitary childhood. And it was like being immersed in this magical land. So it was never lonely, it was so rich, it was a very, very rich, imaginative childhood, and I think I was terribly lucky to have that.
And yet your mother and father were very different, weren't they? How would you characterise them? Yes.
Well, it was a war marriage, and we forget how much of an effect that war had on how people met, the sort of people who got together, the sorts of marriages they formed. He was sort of country aristocracy, I guess, sort of the old Queensland pioneering stock. Pretty awful people, frankly. But he wasn't, he was adorable. And she was a city girl, very cultured, lower class than him, but much more cultured. She was a musician, a singer, pianist, violinist. So they got married during the war. I'm not quite sure how they met. He was a lot older than she was. But I think it was a real love match. I get the sense that it really was. And then he took her out to this remote, fallen down cattle property with no electricity, no car, no neighbours. And they made a go of it.
As a child, did you have much of a sense of the isolation that your mother was feeling?
Not there, no. I was too young to understand that, although I think in that place I understood the sense of space, that Australian sense of space. But certainly by the time I was, I'd say 6, 7, 8, I absorbed that she was alone and lonely and isolated. I wouldn't have been able to put it into words, but children absorb these things sort of without the capability of language. But they certainly get it.
One thing you've achieved magnificently in this book is that you've woven this deep understanding of the human condition with moments of laugh out loud humour.
I'm so glad you said that. This book has got jokes.
It does. I'm going to read out one of those. Despite the dark themes, the book brims with humour. I love this line. Then there was Nana's cousin May, a milliner who had green false teeth that clacked. Your descriptions are phenomenal. Was it a deliberate decision to add these humorous vignettes to lift the mood between the more moving parts?
Not conscious, it's simply how I think, and I think how life is, that life isn't just tragic, it isn't just funny, it's some weird combination of ridiculous, absurd, funny, terrible, unbearable, marvellous. It's all of those things, and that should somehow be reflected in a memoir.
At that time in history, and we have vestiges of it now, men were openly considered to be superior to women.
Yeah.
And in fact, you describe your mother as a, quote, semi-slave. When did you first start railing against this inequity?
It's very hard to say because, again, it's prelingual. But I do remember when my mother became ill, she was depressed before she suicided. And we were together in the house. This was when we moved to the city. And she'd just been to see a psychiatrist. And she said to me, and by then she was very obviously depressed. She was like a punctured balloon, this very, very unhappy woman. And she said to me, "The doctor said I should be happy. I've got a loving husband and 2 beautiful children. I should be happy." And I knew, with just 10 years on this planet, how deeply unjust and how cruel that was. But of course, without, again, the concepts to frame it.
Before we came up here to speak, I showed you the copy of your book that I'd read for this conversation, and I dog-eared about 200 pages with incredible quotes, and that was one of them because I thought it was so heartbreaking, the medical misogyny, the idea that your mother must be hysterical, there's something wrong with her,
but the awful thing was that she believed it. She was trying to puzzle out why she wasn't happy. She believed that doctor.
Later on, your time as part of the Sydney push was fascinating. Tell us about the different dangers that you faced in inner Sydney compared with out in the bush.
Oh, well, city dangers are much more dangerous and often a bit more fun. Well, I was a very feral youngster. I'd come from Brisbane. I didn't know anything. I was very, very green, unformed young woman. And I just had this instinctive drive forward into life because I knew how deep my ignorance was. So I was going to have to make a complete individual out of these little bits and pieces that were left over from childhood. So what I remember of that time is I was probably fearful all the time, but the need to understand the world and to make a person of myself always massively outweighed any fear. So I lived on the streets initially when I got there. I did a lot of exploring. Then I found an old abandoned cottage and crawled through the front window and lived in that for, I don't remember how long, it might have been weeks, it might have been months, but I know I had very clearly in my mind that I would stay in that cottage until I felt myself to be a person, I suppose, or until I understood the city enough to survive in it.
And as part of this, you befriended and worked for some incredibly sketchy criminal characters. Tell us a bit about that and why you were drawn to that life.
Look, you have to remember it was the late 60s and people were experimental and courageous in all sorts of ways. It was the zeitgeist. It wasn't just me, it was the zeitgeist. I'd fallen in with, I'd got a job as an artist model at the East Sydney Tech. And I think through that started meeting intellectual, the sort of bohemian life of the city and the push. I always seemed to be much younger than all of them. I was like the mascot wherever I went. But the wonderful thing about that era was the way people looked after each other in those big, communal houses. And I was taken in and was sort of part of this vast extended family. Then I guess I just heard that there were these jobs going for girls in a illegal gambling casino. And I went along and started dealing poker at the poker table and fell in love with that game within an hour. It is just the most transcendent game. So there followed, I guess, a year or two of working in that club, and eventually trying to put myself through conservatorium as a sort of side thing, until it all got a bit violent, and then I had to leave.
You were extraordinarily courageous to live that life at the age that you were at,
Yeah.
and then to take the journey at the age of 27 across Australia. Where do you think that courage comes from?
Look, I'm not sure that it is courage exactly. I mean, it looks like courage. It's certainly a reckless disregard for consequences. I think it's, as I said before, that the need to understand myself, to understand the world, to build a life for myself, so vastly outweighed any sense of risk. And I guess that driver, it was just a driver forward, and it countered fear. And it wasn't that I wasn't afraid, of course I was afraid. I think I was afraid most of the time. But that seemed irrelevant given the opportunity to experience the world.
When you look back at that time, do you feel like it's you or a different person?
No, she's a completely different person. And I sometimes sort of see pictures of myself then and think, God, I wish I had half your chutzpah. Because it really is like a vanished self. And I assume that everyone has some sense of that, maybe. Maybe it's more acute in my sense because I've shifted around so much and lived such very different lives in each of those geographical locations, so that may intensify it. But really, you know, all of us have these lost selves behind us.
And do you think that's a consequence of ageing or the challenges we face in life? What diminishes us in that way?
Well, I think very obviously we become aware of our mortality. There's that wonderful thing that youth gives us, which is that we don't really know we're going to die. Sorry, I think that was me. But I guess also, as you learn more about the world, you understand just how lucky you've been to have avoided all the terrible things that could have happened. Yeah.
Your time in London was an absolute joy to read about the wonderful Doris Lessing and your lunch with Sydney Pollack.
Oh, Sid.
What was that time like?
Well, again, another universe, a completely different universe. An immensely privileged universe, that one, because by then tracks had come out and had done very well. I got to meet Doris Lessing, who became a sort of mother figure, I guess, a mentor, and I ended up living in her house for a couple of years. And through her and various other people, I met extraordinary, you know, sort of fabulous people, intellectuals and so on. Very privileged, a very privileged time.
Oh, okay, we will. Thank you. But there was regret there too, wasn't there, after a lunch with Sydney Pollack?
Oh, the Sid Pollack. Well, by then a lot of people were trying to make a film of tracks. And I was invited to lunch by Sydney Pollack, who'd just finished making Out of Africa, which was a hugely successful film there. And poor old Karen Blixen would have been turning in her grave, but never mind. So we went to lunch, and the first thing he said was, "Honey, you're not going to like what I'm going to do to your book." And I sort of loved him for that, and we got on very well. I liked him a lot. But I eventually, and he offered me a lot of money, but eventually I said, "Look, I can't give it to you. For one reason, I think I owe it to Aboriginal mob that they be portrayed correctly. And for another, if it's going to be made at all, it really should be made by Australians." So then, I very innocently thought that in those days that writers could have some control over film. It's completely not true. So forget it. If your book gets turned into a film, just take the money and run. So then, after that, there were various iterations of. I'd received these scripts from various would-be producers. Each script more appalling than the one before. And eventually, I just gave up on thinking that the film would ever be made. And eventually, years later, was approached by Emil Sherman and liked him a lot and agreed to sell it to them. And I think they did a terrific job, really. They honoured the book. I'm so glad it was Mia who played the part. We're still very close friends, which is a lovely thing. I think they made it too grumpy. There's not enough jokes in the film, but otherwise a really good attempt.
So that wasn't a regret. It worked out well in the long run.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Really.
Let's swap microphones because I can hear a little bit of feedback on that one. And you're talking more than me, so you have that one.
It is, yes, I could hear the echo.
You've had one life in Australia, one life in London, another life in India. Was Narendra the love of your life?
In some ways, yes. Yes, I would say yes. Extraordinary man. He was of the old Rajasthan feudal aristocracy. I'd met him going through India years and years before, a decade before, quite by chance. We just met so completely by chance. I got to know his family quite well, but then I went on to England to write tracks and I just forgot about India and sort of wiped it away from my mind. Then I was in London, 10 years later, at a bit of a loose end, not quite knowing what I wanted to do. Quite a difficult time in life, not, uncertain about where I was and what I was doing. And some acquaintances invited me to dinner, and there he was. And the chances of us meeting at that dinner were so cosmically remote that it felt like fate. So he said, well, why don't you come to India and do that project on nomads that you wanted to do all those years ago? So I had nothing better to do, so I did. And he helped me with that project. I lived with nomads in Gujarat. There was a project that took a couple of years and I ended up going on migration with those people. Hardest thing I've ever done, nearly killed me. So Narendra was a great friend through all of that. And then eventually, one thing led to another and we became partners. And he was then my partner for 20 years. But it was a sort of aristocratic marriage in the sense that we hardly ever saw each other, which suited us both quite well.
Yes, probably the best kind
of
marriage.
Honestly. We spoke on the phone pretty much every day, though.
It was difficult there, though, wasn't it? Yeah. Physically challenging, even getting to where you lived there.
Yes.
And then doing the work. Take us through some of those dangers.
Well, India's an uneasy country. And also Narendra was a politician, a Congress politician, sort of left of centre politician, and he had a consortium of enemies, including members of his own family. So he was in danger, physical danger, and because I was with him, I was also in some danger. But it is, the tumult that happens every now and then in that country, you can just get swept up into very easily. But it's physically demanding being there. Just the travel, getting from one place to another, it is a demanding place to live on many levels. But we had a house in the Himalayas, which was, I suppose, in some ways the most important home I've ever had. And it was the one place where both of us could go to be away from our troubles and just be together.
And that comes across superbly in the book. I can visualise the house and how happy and centred you are there.
Safe. It's a feeling of safety or sanctuary. Yes. I mean, it wasn't particularly safe. There was leopards around the house and bears and tigers and God knows what, but psychologically safe, I guess you'd say.
After spending time with the nomads in India, you wrote Desert Places, which you describe as the evil twin to Tracks. Why that descriptor?
Because I think Tracks is all about success, overcoming, youth, reaching the end in victory, all of those sorts of things. And Desert Places is about dealing with perpetual and constant failure at many levels. It's a very angry book, Desert Places, I think. I was under such stress, and not just me personally, but I was living with at the ground level with people whose lives are like that all the time, who have no relief from it. And the suffering that humans mete out to each other, this unnecessary suffering, I just got angrier and angrier and angrier, and more sort of helpless in the face of it.
I have the sense reading the book that you would have perhaps lived a different life had your mother not died the way that she did. Would you agree with that?
I don't doubt that, but I don't think it's as deterministic as my mother died, ergo I crossed the desert, or my mother died, ergo I married a prince. It doesn't work like that. I think, more importantly, after her death, I had what it was, and I must have been 12 years old, so much too young to process it, a sort of insight into the mechanisms of reality, that we are immersed in this mystery that we have no way of understanding. It doesn't care about us, it doesn't even know we're here. And for a little kid to have understood that, but have no way of parsing it or processing it, I think that did affect the rest of my life in the sense of pushing me to always try to refute that vision of nihilism, to overcome that nihilism.
So, in a sense, to embrace life, to
try and knit the world back together, to give it a purpose, a meaning, to imbue it with a meaning it doesn't inherently have.
To make sense of the world.
Yeah. And of, this strange conundrum that we're all in, which is being conscious in a place that we can't understand.
You write, I had seen my mother murdered, so to speak, by the ideology of male supremacy. Do you blame your father at all, or the structure of the patriarchy?
Well, it has to be the structure of the patriarchy, of which we are all pawns. My dad as much as anyone else. I think possibly as a child I did blame him, because I know the day that I got home from school, the day that she died, my dad, who was not a demonstrative dad, who'd never taken me in his arms, he was there and he tried to hold me, and I absolutely rejected him. So I think somehow I knew that something about the way he was in the world had in some sense caused the death of my mother. But I don't, and didn't then, and still, and never would blame him.
I'm extremely conscious of not giving away too much that's in the book, because it is a brilliant read, and I highly recommend that all of you buy it after we have this conversation and the Q&A. I'll open it to questions in 5 or 10 minutes, and please feel free to ask anything of Robyn. She's got this enormous brain, a huge heart, and it is an outstanding book. I was surprised, though, I have to say, when I read the book, with your deep love for your father and the lack of blame that you sheeted home to him.
I know. Well, That's the thing about having an ideology. And none of us are free of bias. None of us are free of being influenced by what is around us. He was born into an ideology. I don't think he was a particularly bright man. I mean, he wasn't stupid, but he wasn't an intellectual, let's put it that way. So it wasn't his way to question those sorts of things. I think later in life he certainly did. So his conservatism was, I guess he just didn't have a particular kind of intelligence to really interrogate that at the time. And we forget that none of us can live too far outside. I've said in the book, we can't live too far outside the cliches of our time. And it's true of all of us. And I think that's why it's so important to me to immerse myself in other ways of thinking and other cultures, because it's constantly testing what you assume are correct ways of thinking and being, but ain't necessarily so. So it's incredibly valuable to be in constant doubt about what you believe.
In the current era, we have conversations about misogyny, about patriarchy. We've seen the incredible Black Lives Matter movement in recent years, the Me Too movement. How far have we come and how far do we have to go?
It's sort of impossible to say. I mean, these movements are incredibly important. How they pass out into the world, let's just wait and see. I think what we're coming into in any case is going to be such a difficult time. I mean, obviously it's a difficult time for a lot of countries already who are suffering. I guess what I'm really saying is that for us privileged middle-class people, suddenly it's going to get really hard. So these issues, important as they are, may become eclipsed by the existential issues that we're going to have to face, I think.
I spent the last 7 years researching and writing a book on bias and discrimination in artificial intelligence, and that's what really jumped out to me, that we've come a long way, but we risk going backwards if we don't keep interrogating things, if we don't keep asking questions.
Absolutely. And particularly now, I mean, AI, absolutely terrifying. And it's proceeding at such a rate that the structures by which you might be able to control it or understand it, it's proceeding at this accelerative rate, and we're not keeping up.
The title of your book is Unfinished Woman. Are you finished now or nowhere near that?
Nowhere near. I feel I'm only just starting. No. I quite like the title because it's ambiguous, and of course it's to do with my mother, and it's to do with me, and it's to do with all of us, really.
Did the pandemic and the consequent lockdowns make you reflect on all of your journeys over a lifetime, and that time you spent alone, solitary, that time to think and reflect on your life?
Look, being alone in some ways, I mean, I could be glib and say, you know, the COVID era didn't feel all that different to me, because writers sit alone in a room feeling sorry for themselves anyway. But there's such a difference between the solitude that you choose and the solitude and the isolation that's foisted upon you. So, for example, when I was alone in the desert, there were particular moments where I felt so totally integrated into the world, so absolutely and irrefutably part of this vast network that it was the opposite of loneliness, and yet I was as remote as it's possible to be from other human beings. And other times I've been at a dinner party in London and never felt so lonely in my life. So, I mean, I treasure my solitude, but I try to temper it. I think getting that balance between solitude and intimacy is very difficult. Because if you stay too long in the solitude mode, you go a bit crazy.
And it's a very different solitude and isolation to that which your mother suffered.
Yes.
Because it wasn't her choice.
No, that's right. That's right. And yes, you know, to be surrounded by people who love you, but to feel such terrible, to be so misunderstood, I think, to be not seen in a way. I think that's a terrible fate.
To be rendered invisible.
Sort of invisible, yeah.
One of the things I really enjoyed about your book was the, I suppose, overlapping narratives.
Yeah.
Different times of your life, different messages. I was swept away on the journey. I know that you also teach memoir writing as well as writing. What advice would you give to anyone in the room who wants to write their story, their narrative?
Don't! Give yourself a break. No, not seriously. I mean, if you have to write it, you have to write it. But it is a very difficult form. It's a very slippery form because it seems like it should be easy. You know your own life story, you just put it down. But it's a morally ambiguous form. It's technically very difficult. The power of your words can smother the power of your story. Your version can smother another person's version. I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy, frankly.
I adore your honesty, and that's something that comes through in the book time and again. Aside from learning to paddleboard, what's next for you?
You know, I really don't know. I think once this is truly over, I mean, I keep thinking this book is over, but it just keeps going. I think I'd like to study science, maybe, something very practical, something very there. I'm fascinated by mycology. I have been since I lived in the Himalayas, and tried to record the fungi that were growing up there. So I'd love to do something like that. But I don't really know. One thing I do know, I never want to write another word as long as I live.
Oh, is that right?
Oh, yeah.
Is this your last book?
Oh, without question.
And why is that? Do you feel that that's done, that's enough?
I think I pretty much said what I want to say. Yeah. There may be topics that come along that I'll have something to say about, but the idea of a whole marathon book, nah, I don't want to do that.
Well, thank you for sharing your life, your warmth and your wisdom with us, both through the book and tonight, and for those of you online. Please put your hands together for Robyn Davidson.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for coming. And thank you.
Oh, my absolute pleasure. It's been an honour and a privilege. Now, please ask whatever you would like of this extraordinary human. Please just shoot your hand up and Dan will run a microphone over to you. Who's going to be brave and courageous and rip the Band-Aid off? Yes!
Yay!
Go!
Thank you, Robyn. I'm clearly fascinated. It's many years since I read Tracks, but I've just literally been in the outback. It's daunting. I mean, I suspect if you haven't grown up there, what were you hoping to do with all that? I do remember you had to go out there to kind of train the camels. But,
yes.
But I can't even remember how you fed yourself, but it's vast, and I can't remember how much the First Nations people contacted. I don't think a lot from memory.
Well, I did prepare for 2 years. You know, I was in I went to Alice Springs knowing nothing, like really, I'd never met an Aboriginal person, I'd certainly never seen a camel. And the only idea I had was that I knew I wanted to do something difficult that would form me pull me together as a person. I had no money. I arrived in Alice with $6, so I couldn't afford a car. And I knew there were wild camels out there, and I just thought, well, I'll just get myself some. And I did. But it took 2 years, and it was, I mean, in a sense, that was the most difficult part of that whole journey, because by the time I was ready to leave, I was extremely competent. I'd trained my animals, I trusted my animals. I knew what I was doing. I had the skills then to make that journey a success. I had a fair bit to do with Aboriginal mob in the town camps, because I lived near one town camp, so I'd learned a bit from them. And as I said before, I was lucky enough for an old bloke to decide to come with me for a leg of that journey, and that gave me a huge, tremendous insight into the depth of greatness of that culture, really. Yeah. And it was fun.
Well, the second part of the question is that the difficult thing you said was living with the nomads. Now, was that because it was the social structure and just how dreadful people are? I mean, it's like you found more solace out there alone. It's big country.
Yeah, no, it is big country. Well, I never felt frightened in the desert. I felt very connected in, I suppose, and also I understood my environment. That makes a huge difference. So I felt confident of my environment. Well, I don't know if I was born to it, but I certainly, I certainly moved into it with pleasure and ease, let's say. But with the nomads, it was just hard life. Their lives were hard. They were sleeping 2 hours a night. I was sleeping 2 hours a night. Wherever we went, we were picked on by police, by corrupt politicians, by bandits, we were all sick. They had malaria. I had ear, nose and throat infections. It was just hard. And they were fantastic. I mean, they looked after me like I was part of the gang. But I didn't speak their language because it's a long story, but I'd had to shift from one state into another state in order to find a group who would be willing to take me. And I'd been learning the other language, but I didn't speak this one. But I thought I should grab the opportunity while I could. So there was a bit of, I was physically exhausted, mentally exhausted, and I couldn't communicate properly. So it was really, really very hard. But the anger was on their behalf. And also seeing the end of a way of life. And it was a way of life that they didn't want to part with, but saw no choice. And I go back to see them quite a lot, and there's not a single family still migrating. It's just too hard. Every year they lose people are murdered, put in jail, blah, blah, blah. So now they've sold their flocks, bought trucks, and they rent them out to Adani, who's developed that whole, developed by that I mean totally raised and raped that whole area. Yeah.
I'll grab that back right to
sorry.
Question. I forgot to do it
Yeah,
last
yeah.
time.
Read what the late Jenny Diskey has to say about living with Doris Lessing. Any similarities in your experience with that?
The question is about living with Doris Lessing.
Look, I knew Jenny Diskey very well. She was one of the chickens that Doris took under her wing. I have great admiration for Jenny, but the relationship with Doris was from the beginning a fraught and difficult one. Jenny was not an easy person. Doris would not have been an easy mother.
Young women aren't easy.
No, nor old women. But to be frank, I think that the sorts of things Jenny said about Doris after she died were mean and ungrateful.
So you had a better experience.
Yeah, and Doris was terrible. She's a complicated person, but to me she was wonderful, and she was a wonderful human being. For all her faults and complexities and difficulties, she was a fantastic human being, and we owe her.
Yeah. Well, at least Jenny Giske died well.
I hope so.
From her writing, it seems as if she.
Do we have any other questions? Yes?
Sorry.
I'm curious to know if you still travel much and if there's anywhere you would really like to go that you haven't been yet.
Oh, do you still travel much, and is there anywhere you'd like to go?
Look, people think I'm a great traveller, but actually I hate travelling. I hate all the mess and packing and the anxiety and, it's awful. And you'd only do it if you really wanted to know more about a certain place, I think. I'd love to go to Greenland. I think Greenland's going to become politically important. Just one of those places where things are starting to... anywhere, really. But I'd also like to just travel in Italy and go and stay in 5-star hotels, frankly.
I think that's a quote of the night. I hate travelling. Phenomenal.
When I was 10 when I first read the Nat Geo magazine, and it had such a massive effect on me. But because I was a kid, the stuff that I was drawn to constantly was the relationships you had with animals, with Dookie, the camel, and all your other camels, and your dog, your black dog. And then later, was it in the Tracks for Travelling Light, you wrote about the magpie that you had at that time in Alice Springs. And so those relationships that you have written about with the animals were so they were real and loving. Have you had those kind of experiences with animals since?
Have you had deep relationships with animals since the time of Tracks?
Yes. I have. And I find the miracle of communication, interspecies communication, so compelling and mysterious and wonderful. How an animal so different, a consciousness so utterly different from my own, can recognize me, can relate to me, can, inverted commas, love me, and vice versa. It's a very strange thing when you think about it. I had a wonderful bird, a Himalayan thrush up in the Himalayas, and I kept thinking, how does that creature, whose eye is as big as a pin, look into my eye and recognize me? How is that possible? Yeah, no, animal consciousness and our relationship with them. And of course, as I get older, I get more and more sentimental, I suppose, about animals, and more appalled at how we treat them. Yeah.
Thank you for those wonderful questions. Do we have time for any more, Dan? Great. Who would like to shoot their hand up and ask another question of Robyn Davidson? This is a rare opportunity. Oh, I think there's one here, and if there's one over there. Sorry, shuffling.
India. It's a big story. What do you think it gave you?
What did India give me? Yeah.
What did it give you?
The question is, what did India give you?
Yeah. Well, it's sort of impossible to say, of course. I think India's an immensely frustrating place, of course. I think it demands huge things of you, of individuals. But there's a sweetness in India that's sort of not like anywhere else. 3 of my deepest friendships are there, and they're sort of lifelong. No matter what happens, those people are there. It gave me tremendous insight into what it is to live without the protection of functional institutions. What it's like to really be on the edge of a precipice all the time, and the kinds of moral and human qualities that requires. And it can bring out the worst in people and the best in people. Yeah. What was that?
There's always the wonderful writers.
The wonderful
writers.
Oh, and the wonderful writer, that too, yeah. Yeah, more and more.
Yeah.
Thanks, Robyn.
Pleasure.
In a number of ways, speaking as an ex-geography teacher, tracks was a godsend, because unfortunately we had to teach various landscapes, and teaching desert landscapes was a great gift that you gave. I was first year out teacher in a remote Aboriginal school, and able to use your book day after day to take these kids on a journey back into their own country.
Oh, how interesting.
It was superb to be able to do that. And then years later, I was teaching in a much wealthier school in the city, and I tried the same thing because nothing else was working. And again, I just absolutely fell into that book. And in doing so, I guess there was this relatedness that it's a very rare gift, and it's beautiful to be able to give to children of that sort of teenage.
Yeah.
So how, coming up to this referendum, how do you think white Australians can relate to their own country? And do we relate to this country in any way? Will we ever relate to it?
I don't know how to answer that question. I mean, obviously I'm a yes voter. But having said that, I have to admit that I have no great faith in it making much of a difference. I'm sorry. I hope the yes vote gets up for all sorts of reasons. Possibly more for white fellas than for black fellas, frankly. Well, we don't know. I mean, look, the thing is, colonialism works its way through the culture one way or another. There's a lot, on the plus side, there's a lot of goodwill, there's a lot of willingness to try and understand and come to terms with that bloody past. And I don't know. We just keep trying to build the culture, I guess, and it's such a complex, impossibly complex situation, really, because it's not just about black fellas and white fellas. It's about this mob of Aboriginal mob, this mob of white fellas, this mob of immigrants, that mob of black fellas. It's too complex to make generalisations about, really. I mean, we have to make them, and we have to make these large political gestures, but on the ground, it's really hard and really complicated. So I don't know if that's a useful thing to say or not. Yeah.
It's a very honest answer, and really the perfect way to wrap up our conversation. Robyn, thank you for your eloquent words, your trailblazing work, and for your generosity in sharing from your heart with all of us tonight. Thank you so much for coming along for this special conversation. Please put your hands together for Robyn Davidson.
Thank you so much, everybody.